These days it seems like a lot of people, especially very young, very left-leaning people, are exceptionally ignorant when it comes to what it takes to actually buy a gun in this country. And today, I'd like to take a little time to call out one of these young, ignorant people specifically and set them straight on what it takes to buy a gun. Hey everybody, Yankee here. I don't have TikTok on my phone or any of my other devices, so I don't watch TikTok, but I do have Instagram. And occasionally you see some of these TikTok people on Instagram. And the other day I was just thumbing through Instagram. I had posted something on there, and I came across not a meme, it's a little video by a person called Ian Lightfoot. Now, I will say I really like that name, very Native American, but it seems they have a really screwed up idea about how easy it is to buy a gun in this country. I'm going to show you their little video here, and then we're going to talk about it. As you can see in that video, he's implying that it is as hard, if not harder, to vote than it is to buy a gun. And it would really trigger a lot of people on the right if they tried to make it as hard to buy a gun as they're trying to make it to vote. And he's saying that because imagine if you had to have a real ID or a birth certificate to buy a gun. Well, I hate to break it to him. And how smug he was being in that little video there aside, I think maybe this is just ignorance. But to buy a gun, you have to have more than what you'd have to vote, even if the people who want the most restrictive law passed regarding voting, got their way. Because having a real ID, which, he said like it was a horrible thing, well, that's something pretty much everybody's got to get if they want to fly or enter federal buildings, etc. And all a real ID is a driver's license. It's an updated driver's license. It's just a driver's license that requires the same type of proof that you're a citizen and that you're a person who can have a driver's license in this country that is consistent across all 50 states. It's just something that says this license here, this ID has a consistent standard. And the reason they're doing that is because there's too many states that just say, oh, you say this is your name and you say you're a citizen, here's a driver's license, go apply for benefits. So there's a lot of people walking around that aren't citizens that have driver's license. And this is really risky when you got people going around into federal buildings or maybe even voting that aren't citizens. Now, I personally don't think voter fraud is a problem. And neither does anyone who keeps statistics. Voter fraud is not a problem. Election fraud, well, that's a different issue. I'd be open to talking about that because that's a completely different issue. Remember, voter fraud is when the voters are doing things illegal like voting twice or voting for a relative or voting when they're not a citizen. That happens, but in such small numbers, it doesn't really matter, and they almost always get caught. So it's really easy to catch someone. Because anytime you go like, well, look, this person showed up and voted twice, or this person showed up and voted and they're dead. It's easy to catch. That's why you see it when they do get caught. You see them getting caught. There's not a whole lot of that going on. It's too hard to get away with. However, election fraud, that's when the people running the elections are committing fraud. It doesn't matter who comes in and votes or what they vote if the people running the elections change the votes. So I think, real ID and stuff like that for voting is kind of ridiculous. If you're registered, when you register to get your license, you should register your address, register your name and all your information, and you should have a specific voting place. And when you go there and you have all that information, you should just be able to vote. I don't like tying IDs, especially not IDs that you can scan, to voting, because that's another way for the government to go, hey, look how these people voted. Because if all they got to do is scan your ID, even just see if it's valid, and then say, okay, here's your ballot, go in room number 3 or booth number 3, well then, not real hard to tie that ID to booth number 3 at that time and see how you voted. I don't like giving the government any extra power when they don't need it. Because like I said, voter fraud is almost non-existent and easy to catch. It's election fraud that's the problem. So pretending the voters are the issues, that's kind of like, a smoke screen. And things like ID to vote, that's a smoke screen because they're not the ones having an issue. They're not the ones breaking the law. It's people running the elections that are the danger. So I actually kind of agree with the people who don't want ID for voting. I don't think it's necessary. And I think it gives the government power they don't need. Gives them a way to track us that they don't need to have. But as far as it being easier to buy a gun than to vote, that's ridiculous. Because all those types of IDs you mentioned, birth certificate, real ID, etc., well, we need those to buy a gun. You can't even start the process without that. You can't go to an FFL and buy a gun without doing that. That's federal law. And if you go and you have your ID and you start buying that gun, well, then you go through a background check. An FBI background check on top of your ID. So pretending that even with the most restrictive laws that people want to pass about voting, so pretending even if those became law, that it would be as hard to vote as it would be to buy a gun, that's ridiculous. That's like when Obama said, oh, in a lot of places in this country, especially where black people live, it's easier to get a gun than a book. That was a blatant lie. It was ridiculous. On its face, it was just blatantly stupid. But he said it, and some people believed it. And some people didn't believe it, but they felt they had to defend it because he said it. But that was a ridiculous statement. And as far as buying a gun, it's far more difficult to buy a gun than it is to vote. Now, a lot of people will pretend like, well, because people can go to a gun show or buy a gun privately, it's a lot harder to vote than buy a gun. That you might have a small argument there, but here's the thing. That's a private sale. That's private transfer of property between two American citizens. They should have a right to do that. And it's not like a person who makes a private sale to another person. That doesn't really increase how many people own guns. That's not really a big portion of the way guns come into the population. The main way you buy a gun is you go to an FFL, you buy it from a dealer, you buy it from a gun shop. And that is not that is not easier than voting. It's way harder than voting. It requires a lot. And most states now don't even allow private sales. Period. The whole gun show loophole, there was no loophole that you can go to gun shows and not have to buy and not have to do background checks. If dealers sell you a gun at a gun show, they still do background checks. Only in states where private individuals are allowed to transfer property between them can they do that without a background check, and that's just an individual to an individual, not a business to an individual. That would still be illegal if you have an FFL license to sell guns. So it is possible to get guns illegally, but that ain't easy either. I hate to break it to you. It's not like they try to portray it like every single person that can just roll out onto the street and buy a gun out of the trunk of a car. Not too long ago, one of our reporters, and I use that word, I use that word instead of journalist because, they're not really journalists anymore. This was a reporter who wanted to prove how easy it was to buy an illicit gun. Like how easy you could go out on the streets and just buy an illegal gun. And they did it for months. They tried. Failed every time. Couldn't even find a source most of the time. And they finally resorted to finishing their story by setting up a private sale between two individuals in a state that was legal and saying, look at that illicit gun sale. We bought an illegal gun. Well, no, you didn't. You didn't break the law at all. What just happened was legal. And you showed that when you tried to do it in an illegal, illicit way, you couldn't find a way to do it because it wasn't easy. Most criminals that have guns get them by stealing them, breaking into people's houses, taking them. So unless you're willing to steal, break into someone else's property, take their property, well, then you're probably not going to get a gun illegally. Unless you're a criminal already. And you can't really legislate what criminals do because criminals do whatever they want. They don't follow the laws. You can write as many laws as you want. But the whole notion that it's harder to vote or that the right wants it to be harder to vote than it is to buy a gun. That's silly. And to think that it would trigger the people on the right that if it was hard to buy a gun as it is to vote, that's silly. Now, it does trigger me that we have to jump through hoops to buy a gun. I think it should be as easy to buy a gun as it is to vote. If you're an adult of age, you walk into an FFL, that should be between you and that business, what you buy. You're an American and that's your right to keep and bear arms. If you're a criminal that can't be trusted with your rights, you should be in jail. You shouldn't be out walking the streets. Shouldn't be the burden of the store to know if you're good or a bad guy. If you're a bad guy, they should be locking you up. And it shouldn't be their burden to know if you're going to be a bad guy in the future, if you haven't been one yet. But that's all side story here. The main point is this whole notion that even if you had to have an ID to vote, it'd be harder to vote than buy a gun. That's ridiculous. It's very hard to get a gun. Me being a legal, law-abiding person, when I go buy a gun, I have to prove who I am. I have to go through a background check, and then I have to wait 2 weeks to even pick it up. Tell me that voting's that hard. In my state, they mail a ballot to your house. You fill it out and send it back. Way easier than buying a gun. Wish I could buy guns like that. So this whole notion, like I said, that it's easier to buy a gun than vote, or it's easier to get a gun than a book, that's all garbage. That's all fairy tales and bullshit from the far left to try to keep people on their side because they know real facts don't keep people anti-gun. So I've got no problem with this Ian Lightfoot guy, got no problem with him or how he lives his life or anything else he wants to do or say or any opinion he wants to have. But misrepresenting something like this and pretending like you know when you don't be proud of your ignorance. Don't double down when someone says something on your comments. I made a comment, other people have made comments. He's doubled down since then. When someone tells you you're wrong, shows you you're wrong, just admit you're wrong. Maybe some of that anti-gun indoctrination you've received is wrong. Just like how you know some of the indoctrination people on the right get is wrong. So, like I said, I'm not even on the other side. I'm not even opposing you when it comes to how hard it should be to vote. But the whole notion you think that it's so easy to get a gun, that just shows your ignorance. Don't be proud of your ignorance. I think it should be as easy as you think it is to get a gun, but it isn't. So learn, say you were wrong, own up to it, and make your decisions based on facts, not fiction.